As a nation, I believe we need to talk about services, and not just because they represent or supply more than 2/3 of our economic output and employ almost 90% of our workers, but also because the way we think about services in Australia is about to be transformed quite radically by two economic revolutions. The first, of course, is the industrial revolution centred on Asia and the emerging market economies of Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa. China and the other emerging market economies have added more than 1 billion men and women to the world's manufacturing workforce. The result, as of course we all have experienced personally, is a huge increase in the supply of manufactured goods globally. And that has triggered major structural reform in the advanced economies, including Australia. Manufacturing is now rapidly migrating from the high-income economies, especially the small high-income economies like Australia, to the emerging market economies, where cheap labour is teamed with up-to-date Western technology, bought off the shelf by and large, in world-scale factories, export-dedicated factories. For Australia, we have no choice but to look to the service sector for growth and trade in the future to fill the gap being made by this transition. The second revolution is the digital revolution. That's accelerated the shift from manufacturing to services because it's allowed Australian manufacturers to run global supply chains. They can now control production with, in some cases, finely divided between countries to capitalise on their comparative advantage or the comparative advantages and their willingness to give them tax concessions, of course. And that's reduced the amount of manufacturing activity, or is reducing the amount of manufacturing activity going on in Australia, and it's leaving behind the business services component of these firms, right? Their design, in most cases, I guess, and their marketing and their management and so forth. The other thing, of course, it's doing is it's dragging the services sector into the internationally traded sector of the economy. According to the OECD, or according to their estimates, eventually 15 to 20% of service industry jobs are going to be subject to offshoring, subject to international competition. Alan Blinder, the former deputy chairman of the US Federal Reserve, thinks the number for the US will be more like 1/3 of jobs. So, manufacturers are waning and services are waxing. So what? Well, one of the points we focus on in this report is that the difficulty of coming to terms with having a greater reliance on services. Economists tell us that productivity is the key to growth in living standards. But productivity is much more difficult to measure in services It's been described as, services have been described as the unmeasurable part of the economy by a prominent American economist. Now, this is a dangerous problem because from a policy-making point of view, it's hard to reform or manage something that you can't measure, and very easy to damage it. In many service industries, the problem begins with measuring the output, because the value of the output is determined very largely by quality. That quality might be quite evident to the patient or the client or the consumer, but it's virtually impossible for an outsider to measure. Now, there's obviously one very good guide to quality in services, and that is the price that consumers are prepared to pay for the service. But here we run up against a second problem, and a huge problem. A very large proportion of the service sector, some of our largest service industries, including healthcare and education to the extent that we're talking about domestic educated students, are not in the market sector of the economy. There are no comprehensive sets of purely market-determined prices in these industries. Now, the absence of market-set prices does not prevent us from increasing efficiency. You can see in our public hospitals now we have case mix funding, right? So that increases, that's designed or intended to increase efficiency and output. But the result of the increased efficiency may be no more meaningful than, and I'm not saying this about the hospitals particularly, but I'm just saying it in principle, it may be no more meaningful than the productivity gains, you know, in the proverbial Soviet fashion goods industry. Now, I think we've all met managers who would have been perfectly at home in the Soviet fashion goods industry. And we all know ministers who would be perfectly comfortable with those kinds of managers. So a key issue arising from this report and from the research that CEDA has commissioned, that is the real report, therefore, is the role that markets can or might play, what I'd call competition policy for short. This, of course, goes to the heart of the discussion in the report about healthcare, education, and human services more generally, which have been subject to a major review by Ian Harper and his committee. It also plays, as you'll read in the report, a central role, or be reminded in the report, a central role in the recommendations of the Murray Review of Financial Services. And it's central to the ongoing debate about the banks and superannuation, as you will have noticed. So we're already wrestling with these issues, but we're going to be wrestling a lot harder. You just wait, for example, until the doctors and the other politically powerful professionals feel a large fraction of the heat, the competitive heat that is now being felt by the accountants, and which is outlined in one of the papers in this report. It's a crucial question. Will our politicians follow the successful example of Hawke and Keating and recognise that the main benefit from trade comes from imports rather than exports? Because imports give consumers access to goods and services that can be produced more efficiently by foreigners. And that in turn opens the way for us to specialise more in producing the goods and services that we can produce efficiently, most efficiently. Services has got a quirk on that because a large part of the trade actually is associated with foreign direct investment, something else that we haven't been handling very well lately, and we'll have to rethink. So, hence the urgency of the issues raised in this very timely report by CEDA. CEDA's already done, of course, in the recent past, a major report on vocational education training. This report includes papers commissioned on health and education and vocational training, financial services, accounting, trade, road freight, and urban roads, and if I may say so, there's a powerful story in all of them. They're very different, very diverse. That's one of the things about services, a very diverse sector, but every one of them has something very important to say. From the data that disproves the long-held generality that services are inherently productivity laggards. Many of the important ones are doing as well as the rest of the economy. To the discussion of the detailed discussion of the reforms of health, education and financial services, to the innovations and unexpected by me anyway, challenges faced by tourism, to the crucial role of vocational education and training for the service sector, where particularly those parts of it made up of small to medium-sized firms, and we see that in the road freight industry as highlighted in the report. To the need for better quality investments, decisions, and the unexpected open-mindedness of motorists when it comes to reform in the provision of road services. And of course, the important lessons we learn from reading about the struggle going on in accounting to deal with this blast of international competition brought to us by the digital revolution. And a paper that I personally think should be compulsory reading for anybody who's contemplating jumping on their charger and going off to conquer the markets of Asia. And that's Sue Freeman's paper on exporting vocational education services to India. I think that is a paper that would have saved a lot of careers. A lot of the skeletons now lying beside the road that takes us to Asia would not be there if they, perhaps, I suspect, if they had read this paper. So I'll get out of your way and let you have lunch, but that's my take on the report. Thank you.